So the talk, as you can see, is called the Call It the Now. I've got I'm not going to read off pieces of paper, but I've got some quotes and stats and stuff. So when you see me looking down, I'm trying to remember what I'm supposed to talk about next. Because the reason that I sort of chose this topic was actually this is a sort of confluence of a lot of different ideas, a lot of different things that I've been experiencing, my friends have been experiencing, our clients have been experiencing. And when Vince said, do you want to do this deFrost talk, and saying, well, how do I pull together all these sort of disparate ideas? Because it felt like that there was something behind it. There was a root idea at the bottom through which all these ideas sprung from. So what I try to do tonight is take a lot of what might seem slightly disconnected ideas and put them into a bit of a narrative, a bit of an idea, and hopefully I've done that and achieved that for you. So to start at the beginning, and by the beginning I actually mean the beginning, and actually the Big Bang, if you like. And I wanted to start with this quote. This is a writer called Alexander Spurkin. And we're going to start very, very metaphysical, and then we're going to come right the way down. So let's start right out there somewhere in the mists of the universe. The concept of universal connection. Nothing in the world stands by itself. Every object has a link in an endless chain and is connected with all the other links. The life of the universe, its history, lies in an infinite web of connections. So we start right that way back, and that sort of metaphysical idea that actually life is intrinsically connected. And when you look at all the major religions in the world, that concept of that universal connection is kind of writ large. But then when we sort of, I guess, telescope back in again and get into, I guess, the kind of root DNA and root biology, and actually then think about also the idea of particle physics. Okay, now I'm going from metaphysics to particle physics, and believe me, you won't hear about this after this next little note. But the idea that when you have an electron, okay, now that is only detectable once a photon interacts with it. So these things actually are effectively invisible until an interaction occurs. So we've got a sort of metaphysical idea of connections, and then we have that sort of real true science, that kind of particle physics idea of connections. Now, when we start to then think about friendship and family and companionship, they are also this infinite web of connections. So we're starting to sort of get out of the metaphysical, get out of the kind of particle physics, but into this idea where we're all connected to one another. And that idea is sort of where the building blocks of our DNA. And so connection is hardwired into all of us, whichever perspective you want to come from. You want to come from metaphysical, you want to come from science, you want to come from emotional. Connections are hardwired. But human connections, they are very complex, they're very muddy, they're very ugly, whereas online connections are often very curated, very chosen, very retouched and photoshopped. You know, this is arguably real life, and this is what we might portray once we put our Instagram filter on it. Or if Instagram might be last week, it might be some other new app that we're putting. Oh, what's the new one? The skinny filter. It makes you look really skinny. So you can download that for 99 cents from the iTunes store anytime. So the idea is that no matter how dirty and ugly real life becomes, we can fix it. Like my 4-year-old son says about Bob the Builder, we can fix it. Okay, it doesn't matter. But interestingly, these are just points in our life that are highly selective, whereas, as we know, human life and the narrative of human life is much more bumpy. So the question then becomes, with all these connections that are out there, how do we discern whether one connection is more valuable than the other? Because all those connections are sort of inbound and coming at us 24/7, as we said at the top. This sort of deluge of information, or the fire hose of information I've heard described. Lots of people have lots of different words to describe this information that's coming at us. Overload, tsunami, fire hose, drowning in information, swimming in information. All these negative ideas that somehow information in its totality is somehow bad. And that's not true. What we have to do is actually discern which bit of information coming at us is actually more valuable than the other. We have to get better than that. And it reminds me of that one of my favorite books in secondary school was George Orwell's Animal Farm, that idea of all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And that's still a phrase that I trot out because it's probably the only phrase that I remember from secondary school English. But this idea that not all information is equal. Some information is obviously more valuable than others. So for any marketers in the room, you'll recognize this wonderful pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, what we have here is, who's familiar with this? Well, probably a few are quite familiar with this. You would study it at school. And basically, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it shows all the things that we need as human beings, starting at the bottom, the very basics of breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, and excretion. These are all the things that we need, moving right up to top to morality, creativity, and spontaneity. Now, what I'd sort of argue here is that essentially I think that the human connection that we have, that kind of one-to-one in the physical space, exists in this zone here about the idea of love and belonging, okay, where we have friendship, family, and sexual intimacy. But I argue that actually when we get to think about online connections, we actually leave that zone and move into the next part of the hierarchy of needs, which is self-esteem. And that need for recognition, the need for status, the need for fame, and more importantly, the need for attention. Okay, now, for all of us who use particularly kind of social media, you might recognize that. The idea that actually when we get on there and post a status update, whether it's into Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, are we doing it because we're craving friendship and intimacy? Are we doing it because we're actually craving attention, because we're craving status and recognition? Now, this great lecturer and writer called Sherry Turkle from MIT, who says that connections are not actually conversations. Okay, so when we think back to that pyramid that we just saw and trying to split that idea between what is a connection, what is a good connection, what is a real human connection, and what is a connection that's less valid. And she argues that connections are not conversations. And she says we use conversations with each other to learn how to have conversations with ourselves. So what she means is if you're trying to kind of tease out an idea, something in your head that you're not quite sure, how to play with it in your head, you'll talk to someone, your friends or your family, and you'll use them as the sounding board. There's somebody that we can talk to and bounce ideas off. And in doing so, we start to sort of, teach ourselves the way to have conversations and the way to also have conversations with different people. The conversations we have with our friends are very different to the conversations we have at work, but it's only through the process, the trial and error process of actually talking to one another, do we actually discern how to properly have a conversation. And she argues that actually in the online space, these connections that are more seeking attention rather than at that more love stage of the pyramid, is a flight from conversation. Okay, we're not actually having conversations. We're putting things out there, but these are not conversations. And we've been doing social media strategy, not just at the Nest, but long before that. And I hear all these ideas and clients saying we want to have conversations. I'm saying I don't think you actually really believe that. I don't think you believe you want to have a conversation. I think you want to talk to your customers, and I think you want your customers to talk back to you. But I don't think that's necessarily a conversation, because I don't know that you're ready to hear what they have to say and really take on board, because a conversation is two-way. Having a comment posted on a Facebook status update is not a conversation. It's a comment. It's a single connection. And unless you respond to that and it goes somewhere and it ultimately has some sort of outcome that left you both better off than when you started, then arguably it's meaningless. Now, Sherry Turkle sort of says that for kids growing up, this idea of kind of having more connections but less conversations is highly challenging. So I guess if we just jump back again quickly to this, I guess what I would say is that here really is what I think about. This is where conversations happen, and this is where connections happen. Now, if we're using social media for self-esteem, I imagine these two people are friends. This could just be a very, very cropped, close photograph. All these photographs in the presentation are taken from Flickr, Creative Commons, and all the credits are at the end. That idea of using social media for self-esteem, I heard somebody talk about the idea that when somebody likes your post or comments or shares something, it actually gives us a rush of endorphins. So actually, we're now sort of biologically addicted to gaining affirmation on social media. Now, when they said that to me, I said, yes, that's absolutely true. That is exactly how I feel. When I go from 1 like to 2 likes to 10 likes, suddenly I get more and more excited and I get that endorphin rush and I just want to keep doing it and keep getting more and more likes. So I think it's true. So we are sort of now getting addicted not just to touching the phone and getting those messages, but actually getting that affirmation pushed back to us from the echo chamber, if you like. But we're all accustomed, we've all seen these scenarios where we're at lunch, we're at the pub, we're at a works do somewhere, and we're all having conversations, and there's a bunch of people sitting around us on their phones, checking stuff. And actually, I was watching Jon Stewart on the Comedy Channel the other night, and it was Ariana Huffington from the Huffington Post who said that there was a recent study that showed that 25% of Americans admitted to using their smartphones during sex. And Jon Stewart called her out on it and said, you can't say that without quoting it. She said, no, here's the study. And she gave him the name of the study. So 1 in 4 of us during sex. This is not in that post-coital moment, someone's having a fag, someone's checking Facebook. During sex. So why, and look at the scenario here, let's imagine they're best friends. Why are they sitting there having a cigarette? She's actually also having a fag, but I cropped it. Why are they not talking to one another? What is so important on these devices that it overrides the potential conversation that they can have with one another? What is it in their hand that is more vital? And what is it that we're actually looking for in the moment? And I think that's the question mark that's hanging over all of this sort of discussion. What is it that we can find here that we can't find here? And is it a fear of missing out? You've heard that idea, the FOMO, fear of missing out. Possibly, that's one thing. But you don't need to be on Facebook in order to find out what's happening. There are other ways to find out what's happening in the world rather than constantly checking Facebook. Is it affirmation that we talked about, or is it just bad habits? And I know from my point of view, it is bad habits. And I've checked myself, and when I decided this was going to be the topic of the conversation tonight, over the past month, I've checked myself reaching for the pocket, picking up the phone, and going to Facebook for no reason whatsoever, other than because I've got 2 minutes to fill. And I'm now increasingly distressed by how often in one day I do that action of getting the phone out and checking it. The fact that I've got to now talk for 30 minutes and then have a conversation afterwards and not check Facebook for an hour, it's starting to get a bit twitchy. Before I go on here, I don't know if you can see this. Can you see the name on that little device on the wall? This is a magic thermostat that you can control with your iPhone app. So if you're 2 hours from home and the rain comes on and it gets a bit cold, you can dial up your thermostat and it'll cozy up the house for you by the time you get home. It's called the Nest. And some funny bugger decided to email me a link a couple of months ago when Google bought the Nest for $3.2 billion. I said, no, sadly, that's not our Nest. If it was, I certainly wouldn't be here talking to you today. There's a woman I'm going to quote a couple of times. She's called Megan Miller. I came across this talk that she did from a podcast called Buddhist Geeks. Now, for those of you, some of you who may or may not know me, I fall into both categories there. So this podcast is perfect, where they actually sort of look at what's happening in contemporary society and kind of apply that to this sort of ethics and ideas of Buddhism. Anyway, she quoted these stats, and rather than me kind of reinvent the wheel, I'm going to read this to you. Now, some of these you might have seen on the flyer advertising tonight, which is the average internet user visits 40 websites a day. I think, okay, all right, that feels about right. But switches applications 36 times an hour. Now, that was terrifying when I read that. I thought, is that actually what we do? And actually, as I start to monitor my activity, I now use an app called Rescue Time that monitors how many applications I'm using, and that actually correlates. I do probably go through about 30 applications an hour. What the hell am I doing that I'm switching 30 times an hour? The average smartphone user, so this is not your desktop general user, checks Facebook 14 times a day. All right, so 14 checks on the phone. That's an average. And the average teen receive 75 text messages a day. It's phenomenal. Okay, so a new UK study showed that 51% of commuters have missed their public transit stops because of digital distraction. There you go. I'm sure we all recognize that. Now, this number here, I recently went to this AMIA talk called The Internet of Everything. Now, I'll tell you what the Internet of Everything is if you're not aware of it, is basically this. Essentially what the Internet of Everything is saying is that in a very short period of time, and here by 2016, many of the things that we see in this room that are not currently connected to the internet will be connected to the internet. Okay, now I watched this amazing video that came from Ericsson in Scandinavia where they showed a video about printed chips. Okay, so these are chips, computer chips that you print through, I guess, an equivalent of a 3D printer or a paper printer, and they are fixed to a sticky label. So they can print a chip, stick it on a tin of soup, and that is basically now that tin of soup is now connected to the internet. Okay, so anything can literally be connected, and they're saying that the number of devices that are connected to an IP network will be 3 times the global population within the next 2 years. And that when you think about the disparity between the developed world and developing world, that we will on average have at least 6 or more devices within the next year, doubling to 12 within the year after that. Now, some of them will be in the home. Some of them will be this guy, the Nest, on your home. Some of them will be these things people call wearables, so watches, jackets, whatever, glasses. But a lot of it will be things that just be invisible, stuff that we just don't see. Now, the Opal card, there's one for you, the Opal card, which is now getting rolled across New South Wales, now with the chip in your card that you swipe every time. Now, that's connected. Every time you tap that on, that's a connection that's gone to the cloud, and they know who I am, and they know which gate that I've gone through, a dozen times a week. So all these devices will be perpetually connected. And so what does that mean? Well, it means more and more and more connections every single day, every single hour. But the quality of those connections is really questionable. And because of all this distraction, what we're now finding, and there's many, many studies that support this, is that our brain is actually literally being rewired to be better at multitasking. So our brains are now getting more and more accustomed to things that are distracting. We cope with distractions better, which means things like long-term memory are getting pushed out. I saw this guy talk at TED in Sydney a few years ago who talked about the idea of saying, why do I need to remember where anything is anymore? I don't need to remember where the name of a street or where a particular shop is. I've got it on my device. I don't need to remember your phone number. I don't need to remember your birthday. I've now rescinded responsibility for that information to here. And so I can hopefully leave some space for what? Well, for bad information. So you may be thinking this is a pretty depressing situation, okay? So let's now pause there. Let's take that as far as it's gone, and let's see that we can turn this, hopefully, into a bit of a positive. And so let's look at what we can do as individuals to help this problem. Let's look at what we can do as designers and content makers and producers. And maybe at the end, have a quick look at why the future might not be as depressing as you think. So let's look at ourselves as individuals first before we look at ourselves as creators, as creatives. And you have to ask yourself, the first question to ask yourself is, what is valuable to you? Okay, that is the $64 million question. What do you find out of all these potential connections and this fire hose of information? What is it that is of value and is of interest to you? Because recency, as in the thing that is happening right now, is not by any mean stretch of the imagination the most valuable thing. Just because it's happened now doesn't mean that it's the most interesting or valuable. Let's not use the word interesting. Let's keep on this idea of value. Actually, what might have happened yesterday that I missed because, hey, I didn't pick up my phone 14 times, that thing that happened yesterday might be way more valuable than the thing that just happened 5 minutes ago. How do we work out what is actually going to be of more value to us in this information fire hose? And what sort of tools and techniques can we use? Now, there's a guy called Clay Johnson who wrote this book on this very subject, which is called The Information Diet. And he describes this as a case for conscious consumption. And I really like that idea because that's now what we're talking about. We're talking about if we're standing in front of the fire hose of Facebook or Twitter, that's there's no discernment there whatsoever. It's completely unconscious in that we just consume whatever's thrown at us. So he makes this case for this idea of conscious consumption. And he talks about the trophic pyramid. Now, I'd never heard of the trophic pyramid. Has anybody heard of the trophic pyramid? Obviously, I was asleep at the back of the class during biology. But apparently, the trophic pyramid is this idea that at the bottom of the food chain, okay, the lower you get on the food chain, the more energy value it has. Okay, and as food gets processed and pushed up the food chain, it has less and less energy value. And actually, it's something like as it steps from up the 4 steps on the food chain, it actually takes 10 times more effort to get the same amount of energy from the one below it. Okay, so they actually have, and it goes to primary producers at the bottom, to primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So it's the difference between planting seeds in your garden, pulling the carrots out of the bed, and going to McDonald's and buying a bag of, processed carrots that aren't even real carrots. There's something else colored orange. So it's this idea that further up the chain it gets, and the more processed it gets, the worse it is for us. Okay. Now you can apply that, I think, very nicely to information, and that's essentially what he's done in the book. He's mapped that idea of junk food to junk information. And actually, the information at the source has more value than the information that's been reprocessed further up the echo chamber. And I don't really like this phrase that he used, but I'll call it anyway. He says these guys called info vegans. Okay, and what info vegans do is try to emulate the consumption habit of vegans, but apply that to information. So taking a very strict approach to how they consume information. And I think when we look at the continuum of how we can behave, that's at one end of that's an extreme, okay? Because let's think about that food chain pyramid. That's right at the bottom. That's people who just want to really stay at that source level and not mix it up, if you like. And he also says, which is interesting, that this idea now that the information diet not just requires conscious consumption, but planning. We actually have to put effort into this process and sharpen skills. So it isn't just saying, look, Facebook, my love affair with you is over, I'm going to go and use something else. Actually, the tools arguably are there to some extent, but it actually requires us to make an effort, and it requires us to do some planning, and as he calls them, sharpen skills. And the other thing that he mentions that I think is really interesting is that he says that search engine, good, intelligent, smart use of search engines should be basic literacy for kids. And I agree with that entirely, because just sitting there consuming that information in the fire hose, what can you do to stop it? Well, you can find the source, you can find an alternative. You don't just take what's given to you. So that idea of actually advanced search engine use as a basic literacy, I love that idea. Now we have to choose our platforms wisely, and actually for somebody who is runs a digital agency and celebrates social media every day, I actually don't mind calling things like Facebook and Twitter blunt instruments, because that's, I think, essentially what they are. They're very, very blunt tools, and arguably they don't give us what we really need, and arguably they don't give us what we want. And in some respects, I think that part of the reason that we are experiencing this sort of sense of dissatisfaction is that our needs have now outstripped what things like Facebook and Twitter can do. We want platforms that are much more intelligent, that are much more responsive, much more agile. Now, the problem with Facebook is that it has an algorithm which it refers to as EdgeRank. Some of you might be familiar about this. But basically what EdgeRank is the way that Facebook decides what information is important to you. Because at any one time when you log in, now let's think about those micro connections again. So every post on Facebook, let's call it a micro connection. Every time you log in, the average person with all the friends that are posting and all the pages that are posting and the groups that are posting, any one time you log in, there's potentially 1,200 connections waiting for you. There's 1,200 messages there on Facebook waiting for you at any one login. So Facebook has to determine what's important to you. Okay, so it runs all that information, those 1,200 bits of information, through the algorithm and says, here's the things that we think are important. And it presents, when you log into your news feed, that is a percentage of the whole. And that percentage varies, and in some respects now, the more information that goes out, that percentage gets smaller and smaller. It's roughly about 10% of everything that you could read is what you do read on that. So 90% of stuff that's out there, you're not even seeing because Facebook has decided it's less important. Now, the question I put back to you is, how does that algorithm actually work? And how has Facebook made that determination? And is that the best that we've got? Is that the best determination that we have? And invariably, what you can do is you can set up Facebook lists. So if you haven't set up a Facebook list, give it a go. But what a Facebook list is essentially it looks the same as your news feed, but you consciously bring friends or pages, you add them to that list, and you will see everything that they post at all times. So I've set up a bunch of lists, one of which is, let's say, for example, very much about stuff related to apps, because we do a lot of apps at the Nest. I've got one that's on a particular area of music that I'm interested in. I've got one that's about digital publishing. I've got one that's about nerdy stuff that I like. But I know that I can log in there at any time and just see that filtered information about the stuff that I like. But that isn't a default in Facebook. The default is, let's just throw that fire hose out there at you. So there are some controls there that we can dial up or down, but they're not very good. So that's why I come back to this idea of the blunt instrument. We want something like Facebook to have a much better ability to recognize what it is that we want. Now, that system doesn't exist. Facebook can't give it to us, and no one's built it yet. But the reason that we're all here is because we're feeling this sense of dissatisfaction, that it's inevitable that the next platform that comes along will solve that problem and solve it better. I also set up RSS feeds into what Google Reader used to be a great way to scrape good information off the internet. Feedly is a system that's sort of taken over from Google Reader in some respects. And that's another good way of making sure that you get everything from one particular channel. But there's nothing really intelligent in that. There's nothing discerning in that. You're just, again, getting everything at any one time. But at least you're getting everything rather than what Facebook has selected for you. Now, there's other things that we can do, some basic stuff, like I've recently decided to, I know people who love Apple and love Macs will probably cry when they hear this, but we have to use Outlook here, because we run on Exchange, and I have to use Outlook on this poor Mac, and it cried when I loaded Outlook the first day. But I discovered a very little simple thing in Outlook, which is called work offline, which basically means that the email is turned off. And I choose when to check my email. Now, this is also true for your phone device, that by default, when you load Facebook or all these things onto here, by default, they will send notifications to you whenever anything happens. And it's very easy just to turn those notifications off. In the same way, it's very easy to turn your email notifications off. And the guy, Tim Ferriss, who wrote the 4-Hour Work Week, he talks about this idea of imposed ignorance, where we actually turn the things off. And to actually, when you turn on your desktop or your phone and there's no little number next to an application that tells you how many messages or emails are waiting for you, that day is the day you know that you can live in some sort of state of blissful ignorance. So you can be much more proactive about how you dial these things down. Go in and turn all these notifications off. Choose when you interact, not when Facebook determines that you should do it. There's another thing that I use which is called SaneBox, and this is a subscription that you can buy for email. And what that does is it's basically an intelligent email system, that the more you use it, the more it understands. It's sort of like this Facebook algorithm idea, but you're in control of it. And the more that you use this system and you assign, when somebody's email comes in and you assign it to a particular folder, it learns that and keeps it going. So very quickly, you can start to siphon off things like newsletters, siphon off things from your family you don't want to read till later, or you can basically just siphon people off into folders. And you get back to this state of nirvana, which is inbox zero. Okay, and I think SaneBox describes their service as trying to get us to inbox zero. Now, I don't want to show off, but by a lot of hard, diligent labor, using things like SaneBox, using things like David Allen's Get Things Done GTD system, which if you don't know about, go and check it out. It's an amazing system. Getting to inbox zero is now something I manage to do at the end of every day. And I surprised myself. I didn't think I could do it. Now, that doesn't mean to say I've done everything. It just means that everything that I need to do has been somehow filed in some way, and I can go to that in my own time. Going back into your email and reading the same messages 10 times is a massive waste of time. When I heard that for the first time, they said that if you don't filter your email, you'll read the same email a dozen times before you process it. That is massively inefficient. Just read it, process it, and get on with it. And if processing it means adding that to a list to do later, that's good enough. At least it's out of the way. So the GTD system is really good. I mentioned Rescue Time a little bit earlier. Rescue Time is a service that will actually log all the websites, all the applications, everything you use on your desktop, and you can very quickly see where you're spending its time. It also discerns what it says is distracting or not very distracting. So I look down my list and it says Outlook, not very distracting. And I'll get down to Facebook, very distracting. So it will actually tell you how much it thinks you're actually being distracted during the week. Rachel from our office, who couldn't be here tonight, sadly, because she had to get her hair done. I promised I'd embarrass her about that. She showed us this thing called Peak. Now, Peak, some of you might be horrified by this. Peak is the same as Rescue Time, but an employer does it for everybody who's in their employ. So I could theoretically, if I decided to put Peak on every machine, see every website, every software application. It's supposed to be about productivity. To me, it sounds terrifying. But it's there, and before you know it, it might be on your desktop. But the tools, those tools, and there are lots of them out there, they're only the first stage of it. We also need to retrain our minds. Now, for any of you who were here the other month and saw Kat Burgess's talk about mindfulness, if you were there, I hope you agree it was a great talk. And this partially talks to this, about the idea where we have to intervene in our own lives and create spaces, both temporal in terms of creating time and physical, creating literal spaces where we basically seek refuge. Not so much, I think refuge is probably too harsh a term, but we don't allow the information to come at us in those spaces. Okay, so people talk about this idea of the digital Sabbath or digital detox. Now, I don't buy into it. I've tried it, and it doesn't really work. It feels like it's just it's almost a kind of short-term solution. I'm going to turn my phone off today, but I'll turn it back on tomorrow, and I'll just do the same as what I did yesterday. So I've got to try and think about how you put time into the day rather than taking a whole day off. And it's about when you're at the bus stop, it's about not checking the phone. It's about having that moment where you learn to be bored again. I don't know if anyone saw this great picture that went around Facebook last month, and I got it from about 10 different people, where it's a bunch of people standing on a train station. And at first it said, can you see the odd one out? And it took me ages to see it. Everybody in the picture was doing this, and there's one guy right at the back who's just looking at the sky. And the question, the quote was, what's he doing? What's so important that he's looking at the sky and not his phone? So Wired magazine, they produced this article last year about this idea of mindfulness taking over as a concept in Silicon Valley. And there's now this Google program which is all about mindfulness. If you don't know what mindfulness is, it's basically a sort of very contemporary reworking of sort of Buddhist meditation techniques, but without that Buddhist stuff. And just more the kind of quiet time. And Wired described it as saying, and this is hilarious, the idea that quiet contemplation in Silicon Valley is seen as the new caffeine. It's the fuel that allegedly unlocks productivity in creative bursts. But obviously as a Buddhist, I believe in that idea of quiet contemplation and quiet space. And I can see why Google is pushing this idea and this program through all of its staff to find space where we quieten down and turn off. And so I think that's a very valuable idea. Now, the next part of it is to ask yourself whether you're part of the problem, okay? And ask yourself, what is it that's valuable to everybody else? Because we can stand and get anxious that we're getting too much information. But when we pass that back and say, well, actually, what are we doing about that? Maybe we're putting out too much information ourselves. And we must be more considerate about what we post and what we interact with. And that idea that I was talking to Bex, our executive producer, last night, and we're going around the corner to this AGDA event, and I was just about to get on my phone and go, I'm off to this AGDA event. And then I stopped and I turned to Bex and I said, who cares? Who cares that I'm going to this AGDA event? Now, the fact that I'm doing the AGDA event is important. I think it's important because I'm doing it. But the opportunity for people to decide that they're going has long gone, okay? Because it's now 5 minutes before it started. So if you wanted to go to it, you would have decided you're going to it last week. You'd have bought a ticket. Okay? If you decide you want to go to it now, sorry, you're too late because it's literally starting in 5 minutes' time. So who cares that I'm going to that? Because I already told people on Twitter when I announced it and tickets were on sale 2 weeks ago. So why do I feel the need to tell them again that I'm going to be there and do that? Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's right or wrong, but it was to stop myself from posting and ask myself why I'm doing this. What is the value in this exchange? Because it seems like when I stop and say the value is me, the value is saying, hey guys, I'm doing a fucking talk at Agda, isn't that great? You know? When actually, is that valuable? No, it's valuable to me to big myself up and say, isn't that great, I'm doing this thing. But what value is it to people who are sitting on Twitter or Facebook and to get this message? There he goes again, banging on about Agda. So we have to think about what is it that's valuable that we're putting out there, and are we actually part of the problem? And balancing production and consumption. Now, as designers, as content creators, as marketers, as advertisers, as producers, what can we do to help this problem? And when I was looking through Flickr, I love this, and I love this because here is a campaign, an H&M campaign, and they've probably spent a truckload of money in the photo shoot and in the graphic design and getting this stuff printed. You know, who knows if this is a billboard or outside? This costs a lot of money. And here's somebody who's banging the market, standing next to them, checking their phone, couldn't give a damn, couldn't care less. What this does, I think, is say, well, here's somebody who's in your market. Here's somebody who's really interested, potentially, in what you've got. But you're sort of interrupting them, doing whatever it is that she's doing. And you're interrupting them with this stuff. And actually, this inherently doesn't really have any value. It's a billboard. And the billboard itself has no inherent value. What's valuable to her with what you've got? So it's trying to put yourself in to say, rather than us interrupt you doing what you're doing in your day, what is it that you consider to be valuable, and how can I give that to you? Okay? Because, you know, we can have another debate some other night about the value of advertising. But I guess where digital is starting to push, which is away from traditional advertising, is that digital is now getting into spaces where we try to, I guess, be more interesting. We've got more scope to be interesting because the amount of channels that we have and the way that we play with those channels gives us much more scope than something like this, okay? And that we actually have the ability to have, I guess, an extended engagement, for want of a better word, over a period of time that traditional advertising can do, but doesn't operate in quite the same way. So when we talk about digital marketing or digital engagement, it isn't actually what I would call marketing. It's a very different process, a different way of thinking. Content marketing is a phrase we hear a lot, but really it's what is content marketing other than trying to give people something that's much more valuable, okay, than straight traditional advertising images. That's what content marketing is about. Content marketing says, who are we talking to? What do they want to know? What are they interested in? How do we give it to them through the prism of our brand and our business? And if you can't give it to them, then that's a major disconnect between yourself and your customer. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. But really what we have to do is work with clients to determine what that value is and not just jump to this execution. If you were to put your target customer in front of you and say, what is it that I can give you that's of value? I'll bet they don't say this. I bet that's not what they say. They'll give you some other thing that you've probably not even thought of yet. And the other thing is, I guess, that idea of is now a good time? Okay, and this is the idea, I guess, of the cult of the now. And I see this because I'm guilty of it, but I know that a lot of my clients are guilty of it as well. I've got a great idea for a Facebook post. We've just done something awesome. Let's tell everyone about it. Let's post it now. And in that whole phrase, you know, what is wrong with this sentence? Well, there's a ton of things wrong with this sentence. One, the stuff we just talked about is that actually valuable? But actually that other question is, why is it important to tell someone right now? What time of day is it? What are they doing when I tell them? Is it important that I tell them right now? Is it important that I tell them on Facebook? Or should I tell them through another medium? We actually found, I read this report recently, that more people open email newsletters. This is in the, I guess, in the sort of creative sector. More people open email newsletters on a Sunday afternoon than any other time of week. Okay, that's people deciding consciously to go into email, check email, read. That's a good time to get that person. Okay, now 10 o'clock on a Monday morning when they've got their working week sprawling out in front of them, that's not a good time to stop them and tell them how awesome you are. Okay, and a Sunday afternoon when they're relaxing and thinking about what am I going to do next week, maybe I'll go and see an exhibition, or look at this great email, maybe I'll go and do that. And so one of the most basic fundamental tenets of social media, the clue is in the name. People use it in their social time. Okay, so post stuff that is relevant and useful to them in their social time, not in the middle of the workday, unless you've got something that is incredibly relevant at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. But what is? The next question, I guess, is one that's again, we could have a whole other talk about this some other time. But from a design point of view, and really what I try to champion and what we really try and do at the Nest, and believe me, we haven't conquered it yet, maybe we never will conquer it, is this idea of having a design that is entirely user-centric. Now, you've heard this phrase time and time again, probably, the idea of user-centered design. The problem is that most clients, I'm sure if you work in digital or even if you work in design, you'll know this too, that trying to convince a client that users, customers, audience come first ahead of your business needs and business requirements and marketing requirements, that is a very, very hard sell. Because it's always, we've got this to say, we've got to make sure we say this, we must say this is what our brand does, this is what we must say. And to posit that question, well, the people that you're talking to, what do they want to hear? What's useful and valuable to them? So although we like to think that we push the idea of user-centered design, invariably it's partially user-centered and partially client-centered. And I hope that we can dial up more user-centered and less client-centered, because ultimately when we get to that point, we're delivering something that's of real value to the people that they're talking to. Now, another thing that you might have noticed from a design perspective is from a lot of sites these days is the disappearance of the sidebar. Where's the sidebar gone? It's like, where's Wally? Where's the sidebar gone? And now a lot of sites are going for that very simple, stripped back, single column, long scrolling approach where the old sidebar has suddenly disappeared. The idea of having effectively a 2 or 3 column website has also disappeared to a large extent. Single column. Now the reason, and I think this is quite a clever reason, and we apply this where relevant, is they were actually helping people, some might say forcing people, but helping people to stay focused on this particular piece of content. The story, this narrative that I'm telling you, stay focused. Go down the page, keep reading. Don't click in the sidebar, don't go off there. And now this is contrary to, let's take something like the Sydney Morning Herald, where as soon as you start reading that article, there's a dozen things waiting for you to click. Now actually that's massively distracting, obviously. And for good content, valuable content that we think is actually going to be a benefit to our audience, having them locked into that omni-focus, that single focus, is actually really good and really important. Now, I guess a slight aside to this is sites and services like Pocket and Instapaper and Read It Later, and all those sites that allow you to basically read the content of a web page without that distracting thing called design. Just get rid of it and just let me read the text. Now, these services are getting increasingly popular. More and more people use it. And why is that? Because design is distracting. We're putting too many of these things in front of the user. Go this way, do this, click this. We're giving them too many options. And actually what I'd argue is they will actually try and reduce the amount of options that we give to people. We've got them on the page, they're interested in it, let's keep them there. And the next thing that we give them, let's make that hyper-relevant. Let's make that extend what it is that they've just read, okay? Let's make that actionable. Let's do something. You've read the page, now do something. Not click off and read something else that's only tangentially or even not at all relevant. I've talked about this, so I'll skim over it, this idea of being strategic about developing content. But I will say there's an idea that sort of surfaced many years ago, this idea of transmedia. If you work in TV or film, you might have heard of it. So the idea that a narrative doesn't just exist on one channel, it spools across multiple channels. But instead of a multi-channel approach, which is basically the same thing on all channels, what transmedia does is it takes a narrative and it weaves it across different channels. So you have a story, and whichever channel you find that story, it's a different part of the story. It extends the world rather than duplicates it. I think that's a really interesting idea. And there's a writer who sort of transposed that idea onto our own lives and saying, if you pick up every little status update and Instagram photo and tweet and blog post and comment and laid them all out in a linear fashion from end to end, there is the narrative of your life. We are actually putting our life up there through all these channels. We're telling our story. Now, what's the problem with that? The story's not very interesting. You know, if you actually took all my tweets and things and laid them out end to end and read it, it'd be thoroughly boring. Now, there might be some great events in there, I hope, that make it really interesting. That's why a film is much more interesting, because we cut out all the boring bits. So I argue that actually the content is that we're driving towards this idea of narrative, but making sure that all the little points in that story have interest and have value and aren't just very tedious and boring. Narrative is actually something that content marketing, I guess, and digital, to me, that's the advantage over traditional marketing, is that we have an ongoing story, the ability to continually compound on what we've done before in a sense that's actually much more creative. This is, I was going to say it's a great example of cosplay, but it's not a great example of cosplay. It's an example of cosplay. This is someone dressed as Doc Emmett Brown from Back to the Future, but that's a pretty impressive DeLorean that they've built there. But the reason I'm showing you that is, of course, to think about now the future. And do we need to get this all right now? Do we need to make sure we solve this right now? And I guess I'd say no, because these questions, I think, are just really early questions, insofar as these problems are not going to disappear. We're not going to solve the problems. They're actually arguably just going to exacerbate and get worse. So this idea of actually turning into conscious consumption, we can dial that on now. It'll make it easier as we go on, because things are only going to get a lot tougher. But it's true that when we go back to that idea of the Internet of Everything that I told you about before, that devices will become much more, shall we say, in a Terminator Skynet fashion, they become much more sentient. And devices will be able to do things of their own accord for us without us having to do them. So actually those micro interactions, a lot of them that we do now, we may in the future not have to do some of them because they're being done for us. So we could have less interactions, potentially, perversely, the more of these connections that exist. And I think and I hope that our social networks will improve. Because as I say, I think Facebook is a pretty blunt instrument just now, and hopefully over time, those services will continue to evolve to allow us to have a much greater degree of flexibility over what it is that we can do. And I guess finally, I started with that slide that said this is the beginning. But actually, and I've used this phrase before, I firmly believe that this is just the end of the beginning. That actually all the problems that we're experiencing just now are essentially growing pains or even birthing pains. This hyperconnectivity that we're experiencing is just the beginning. And that actually, as we've already seen, we're going to get more and more connected as we go on. And we'll think less and less of it. We will have to change the way that we process information very quickly if we're to adapt and survive, because as I say, it's only going to get worse. But I hope that some of the things that are around just now will disappear. I hope that in 50 years' time, we'll sort of look back and say, do you remember when people used to post pictures of their lunch on Instagram? How funny. Hopefully, we'll never have to see that again. But also, I guess, when we flip back to the very, very beginning and that initial slide, and if we do take this idea of connectivity as being at the heart of everything, and whether, again, that was metaphysical or particle physics or emotional, what is the internet other than a bunch of connections? Okay, the internet, if you can argue, and there are some philosophers that do argue, is the logical extension, is the evolutionary stage. Now that to me is a little far out, but the idea that actually connections are what drives us. And we're only going to get more and more connected as we get on, less and less connected. So it is the end of the beginning, and hopefully I've given you a little bit of things to think about to help as we go forward.